Book 2, Chapter 6 of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by andmortar. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Book 2, Constance. Chapter 6 The Widow. 1. Constance, alone in the parlour, stood expectant by the set tea-table. She was not wearing weeds. Her mother and she, on the death of her father, had talked of the various disadvantages of weeds. Her mother had worn them unwillingly, and only because a public opinion not sufficiently advanced had intimidated her. Constance had said, "If ever I'm a widow, I won't wear them," positively in the tone of youth, and Mrs. Baines had replied, "I hope you won't, my dear." That was over 20 years ago, but Constance perfectly remembered. And now she was a widow. How strange, and how impressive was life! And she had kept her word, not positively, not without hesitations, for though times were changed, Bursley was still Bursley, but she had kept it. This was the first Monday after Samuel's funeral. Existence in the house had been resumed on the plane which would henceforth be the normal plane. Constance had put on for tea a dress of black silk with a jet brooch of her mother's. Her hands, just meticulously washed, had that feeling of being dirty which comes from roughening of the epidermis caused by a day spent in fingering stuffs. She had been going through Samuel's things and her own, and ranging all anew. It was astonishing how little the man had collected of things in the course of over half a century. All his clothes were contained in 2 long drawers and a short one. He had the least possible quantity of haberdashery and linen, for he invariably took from the shop such articles as he required, when he required them, and he would never preserve what was done with. He possessed no jewellery, save a set of gold studs, a scarf ring, and a wedding ring. The wedding ring was buried with him. Once, when Constance had offered her father's gold watch and chain, he had politely refused it, saying that he preferred his own, a silver watch with a black cord, which kept excellent time. He had said later that she might save the gold watch and chain for Cyril when he was 21. Beyond these trifles and a half-empty box of cigars and a pair of spectacles, he left nothing personal to himself. Some men leave behind them a litter which takes months to sift and distribute, but Samuel had not the mania for owning. Constance put his clothes in a box to be given away gradually, all except an overcoat and handkerchiefs, which might do for Cyril. She locked up the watch and its black cord, the spectacles and the scarf ring. She gave the gold studs to Cyril. She climbed on a chair and hid the cigar box on top of her wardrobe, and scarce a trace of Samuel remained. By his own wish, the funeral had been as simple and private as possible. 1 or 2 distant relations, whom Constance scarcely knew, and who would probably not visit her again until she too was dead, came and went, and lo, the affair was over. The simple celerity of the funeral would have satisfied even Samuel, whose tremendous self-esteem hid itself so effectually behind such externals that nobody had ever fully perceived it. Not even Constance quite knew Samuel's secret opinion of Samuel. Constance was aware that he had a ridiculous side, that his greatest lack had been a lack of spectacular dignity. Even in the coffin, where nevertheless most people are finely effective, he had not been imposing, with his finicky little grey beard persistently sticking up. The vision of him in his coffin, there in the churchyard, just at the end of King Street, with the lid screwed down on that unimportant beard, recurred frequently in the mind of the widow as something untrue and misleading. She had to say to herself, "Yes, he is really there, and that is why I have this particular feeling in my heart." She saw him as an object pathetic and wistful, not majestic, and yet she genuinely thought that there could not exist another husband quite so honest, quite so just, quite so reliable, quite so good as Samuel had been. What a conscience he had! How he would try and try to be fair with her! 20 years she could remember of ceaseless, constant endeavour on his part to behave rightly to her. She could recall many an occasion when he had obviously checked himself, striving against his tendency to cold abruptness and to sullenness, in order to give her the respect due to a wife. What loyalty was his! How she could depend on him! How much better he was than herself, she thought with modesty. His death was an amputation for her, but she faced it with calmness. She was not bowed with sorrow. She did not nurse the idea that her life was at an end. On the contrary, she obstinately put it away from her, dwelling on Cyril. She did not indulge in the enervating voluptuousness of grief. She had begun in the first hours of bereavement by picturing herself as one marked out for the blows of fate. She had lost her father and her mother, and now her husband. Her career seemed to be punctuated by interments. But after a while her gentle common sense came to insist that most human beings lose their parents, and that every marriage must end in either a widower or a widow, and that all careers are punctuated by interments. Had she not had nearly 21 years of happy married life? 21 years rolled up. The sudden thought of their naive ignorance of life, hers and his when they had first married, brought tears into her eyes. How wise and experienced she was now! And had she not Cyril? Compared to many women, she was indeed very fortunate. The one visitation which had been specially hers was the disappearance of Sophia, and yet even that was not worse than the death outright of Sophia, was perhaps not so bad, for Sophia might return out of the darkness. The blow of Sophia's flight had seemed unique when it was fresh, and long afterwards had seemed to separate the Baines family from all other families in a particular shame. But at the age of 43, Constance had learnt that such events are not uncommon in families, and strange sequels to them not unknown. Thinking often of Sophia, she hoped wildly and frequently. She looked at the clock. She had a little spasm of nervousness, lest Cyril might fail to keep his word on that first day of their new regular life together. And at the instant he burst into the room, invading it like an armed force, having previously laid waste the shop in his passage. "I'm not late, mother, I'm not late," he cried proudly. She smiled warmly, happy in him, drawing out of him balm and solace. He did not know that in that stout familiar body before him was a sensitive, trembling soul that clutched at him ecstatically as the one reality in the universe. He did not know that that evening meal, partaken of without hurry after school had released him to her, was to be the ceremonial sign of their intimate unity and their interdependence, a tender and delicious proof that they were all in all to each other. He saw only his tea, for which he was hungry, just as hungry as though his father were not scarcely yet cold in the grave. But he saw obscurely that the occasion demanded something not quite ordinary, and so exerted himself to be boyishly charming to his mother. She said to herself how good he was. He felt at ease and confident in the future, because he detected, beneath her customary judicial, impartial mask, a clear desire to spoil him. After tea she regretfully left him at his home lessons in order to go into the shop. The shop was the great unsolved question. What was she to do with the shop? Was she to continue the business or to sell it? With the fortunes of her father and her aunt, and the economies of 20 years, she had more than sufficient means. She was indeed rich according to the standards of the square, nay, wealthy. Therefore she was under no material compulsion to keep the shop. Moreover, to keep it would mean personal superintendence and the burden of responsibility, from which her calm lethargy shrank. On the other hand, to dispose of the business would mean the breaking of ties and leaving the premises, and from this she also shrank. Young Lawton, without being asked, had advised her to sell. But she did not want to sell. She wanted the impossible, that matters should proceed in the future as in the past, that Samuel's death should change nothing save in her heart. In the meantime, Miss Insull was priceless. Constance thoroughly understood one side of the shop, but Miss Insull understood both, and the finance of it also. Miss Insull could have directed the establishment with credit, if not with brilliance. She was indeed directing it at that moment. Constance, however, felt jealous of Miss Insull. She was conscious of a slight antipathy towards the faithful one. She did not care to be in the hands of Miss Insull. There were one or two customers at the millinery counter. They greeted her with a deplorable copiousness of tact. Most tactfully they avoided any reference to Constance's loss, but by their tone, their glances at Constance and at each other, and their heroically restrained sighs, they spread desolation as though they had been spreading ashes instead of butter on bread. The assistants, too, had a special demeanour for the poor lone widow which was excessively trying to her. She wished to be natural, and she would have succeeded had they not all of them apparently conspired together to make her task impossible. She moved away to the other side of the shop, to Samuel's desk, at which he used to stand, staring absently out of the little window into King Street, while murmurously casting figures. She lighted the gas jet there, arranged the light exactly to suit her, and then lifted the large flap of the desk and drew forth some account books. "Miss Insull," she called, in a low, clear voice, with a touch of haughtiness and a touch of command in it. The pose, a comical contradiction of Constance's benevolent character, was deliberately adopted. It illustrated the effects of jealousy on even the softest disposition. Miss Insull responded. She had no alternative but to respond, and she gave no sign of resenting her employer's attitude. But then Miss Insull seldom did give any sign of being human. The customers departed, one after another, obsequiously sped by the assistants, who thereupon lowered the gases somewhat, according to secular rule, and in the dim eclipse, as they restored boxes to shelves, they could hear the tranquil, regular, half-whispered conversation of the two women at the desk, discussing accounts, and then the chink of gold. Suddenly there was an eruption. One of the assistants sprang instinctively to the gas, but on perceiving that the disturber of the peace was only a slatternly girl, hatless and imperfectly clean, she decided to leave the gas as it was, and put on a condescending, suspicious demeanour. "If you please, can I speak to the missus?" said the girl breathlessly. She seemed to be about 18 years of age, fat and plain. Her blue frock was torn, and over it she wore a rough brown apron, caught up at one corner to the waist. Her bare forearms were a brick-red colour. "What is it?" demanded the assistant. Miss Insull looked over her shoulder at the shop. "It must be Maggie's, Mrs. Hollins's daughter," said Miss Insull under her breath. "What can she want?" said Constance, leaving the desk instantly, and to the girl, who stood sturdily holding her own against the group of assistants: "You are Mrs. Hollins's daughter, aren't you?" "Yes, ma'am." "What's your name?" "Maggie, mum. And if you please, mother have sent me to ask if you'll kindly give her a funeral card." "A funeral card?" "Yes, of Mr. Povey. She's been expecting one, and she thought as how perhaps you'd forgotten it, especially as she wasn't asked to the funeral." The girl stopped. Constance perceived that by mere negligence she had seriously wounded the feelings of Maggie senior. The truth was, she had never thought of Maggie. She ought to have remembered that funeral cards were almost the sole ornamentation of Maggie's abominable cottage. "Certainly," she replied after a pause. "Miss Insull, there are a few cards left in the desk, aren't there? Please put me one in an envelope for Mrs. Hollins." She gave the heavily bordered envelope to the ruddy wench, who enfolded it in her apron, and with hurried, shy thanks ran off. "Tell your mother I send her a card with pleasure," Constance called after the girl. The strangeness of the hazards of life made her thoughtful. She, to whom Maggie had always seemed an old woman, was a widow, but Maggie's husband survived as a lusty invalid, and she guessed that Maggie, vilely struggling in squalor and poverty, was somehow happy in her frowsy, careless way. She went back to the accounts, dreaming. 2. When the shop had been closed, under her own critical and precise superintendence, she extinguished the last gas in it and returned to the parlour, wondering where she might discover some entirely reliable man or boy to deal with the shutters night and morning. Samuel had ordinarily dealt with the shutters himself, and on extraordinary occasions and during holidays Miss Insull and one of her subordinates had struggled with their unwieldiness. But the extraordinary occasion had now become ordinary, and Miss Insull could not be expected to continue indefinitely in the functions of a male. Constance had a mind to engage an errand boy, a luxury against which Samuel had always set his face. She did not dream of asking the Herculean Cyril to open and shut shop. He had apparently finished his home lessons. The books were pushed aside, and he was sketching in lead pencil on a drawing block. To the right of the fireplace, over the sofa, there hung an engraving after Landseer, showing a lonely stag paddling into a lake. The stag at eve had drunk, or was about to drink, his fill, and Cyril was copying him. He had already indicated a flight of birds in the middle distance. Vague birds on the wing being easier than detailed stags, he had begun with the birds. Constance put a hand on his shoulder. "Finished your lessons?" she murmured caressingly. Before speaking, Cyril gazed up at the picture with a frowning, busy expression, and then replied in an absent-minded voice, "Yes," and after a pause, "except my arithmetic. I shall do that in the morning before breakfast." "Oh, Cyril!" she protested. It had been a positive ordinance for a long time past that there should be no sketching until lessons were done. In his father's lifetime Cyril had never dared to break it. He bent over his block, feigning an intense absorption. Constance's hand slipped from his shoulder. She wanted to command him formally to resume his lessons, but she could not. She feared an argument. She mistrusted herself, and moreover it was so soon after his father's death. "You know you won't have time tomorrow morning," she said weakly. "Oh, mother," he retorted superiorly, "don't worry." And then, in a cajoling tone, "I've wanted to do that stag for ages." She sighed and sat down in her rocking chair. He went on sketching, rubbing out and making queer expostulatory noises against his pencil, or against the difficulties needlessly invented by Sir Edwin Landseer. Once he rose and changed the position of the gas bracket, staring fiercely at the engraving as though it had committed a sin. Amy came to lay the supper. He did not acknowledge that she existed. "Now, Master Cyril, after you with that table, if you please," she announced herself brusquely, with the privilege of an old servant and a woman who would never see 30 again. "What a nuisance you are, Amy," he gruffly answered. "Look here, mother, can't Amy lay the cloth on that half of the table? I'm right in the middle of my drawing. There's plenty of room there for two." He seemed not to be aware that in the phrase "plenty of room for two" he had made a callous reference to their loss. The fact was, there was plenty of room for two. Constance said quickly, "Very well, Amy, for this once." Amy grunted, but obeyed. Constance had to summon him twice from art to nourishment. He ate with rapidity, frequently regarding the picture with half-shut, searching eyes. When he had finished, he refilled his glass with water and put it next to his sketching block. "You surely aren't thinking of beginning to paint at this time of night?" Constance exclaimed, astonished. "Oh yes, mother," he fretfully appealed. "It's not late." Another positive ordinance of his father's had been that there should be nothing after supper except bed. 9 o'clock was the latest permissible moment for going to bed. It was now less than a quarter to. "It only wants 12 minutes of 9," Constance pointed out. "Well, what if it does?" "Now, Cyril," she said, "I do hope you're going to be a good boy and not cause your mother anxiety." But she said it too kindly. He said sullenly, "I do think you might let me finish it. I've begun it. It won't take me long." She made the mistake of leaving the main point. "How can you possibly choose your colours properly by gaslight?" she said. "I'm going to do it in sepia," he replied in triumph. "It mustn't occur again," she said. He thanked God for a good supper and sprang to the harmonium, where his paint box was. Amy cleared away. Constance did crochet work. There was silence. The clock struck 9, and it also struck 9:30. She warned him repeatedly. At 10 minutes to 10 she said persuasively, Now, Cyril, when the clock strikes 10, I shall really put the gas out." The clock struck 10. "Half a mo', half a mo'," he cried. "I've done, I've done." Her hand was arrested. Another 4 minutes elapsed, and then he jumped up. "There you are," he said proudly, showing her the block, and all his gestures were full of grace and cajolery. "Yes, it's very good," Constance said, rather indifferently. "I don't believe you care for it," he accused her, but with a bright smile. "I care for your health," she said. "Just look at that clock." He sat down in the other rocking chair deliberately. "Now, Cyril." "Well, mother, I suppose you'll let me take my boots off." He said it with teasing good humour. When he kissed her good night she wanted to cling to him, so affectionate was his kiss, but she could not throw off the habits of restraint which she had been originally taught, and had all her life practised. She keenly regretted the inability. In her bedroom, alone, she listened to his movements as he undressed. The door between the two rooms was unlatched. She had to control a desire to open it ever so little and peep at him. He would not have liked that. He could have enriched her heart beyond all hope, and at no cost to himself, but he did not know his power. As she could not cling to him with her hands, she clung to him with that heart of hers, while moving sedately up and down the room alone. And her eyes saw him through the solid wood of the door. At last she got heavily into bed. She thought with placid anxiety in the dark, "I shall have to be firm with Cyril." And she thought also, simultaneously, "He really must be a good boy. He must," and clung to him passionately, without shame. Lying alone there in the dark, she could be as unrestrained and girlish as her heart chose. When she loosed her hold, she instantly saw the boy's father arranged in his coffin or flitting about the room. Then she would hug that vision too, for the pleasure of the pain it gave her. 3. She was reassured as to Cyril during the next few days. He did not attempt to repeat his ingenious naughtiness of the Monday evening, and he came home directly for tea. Moreover, he had, as a kind of miracle performed to dazzle her, actually arisen early on the Tuesday morning and done his arithmetic. To express her satisfaction, she had manufactured a specially elaborate straw frame for the sketch after Sir Edwin Landseer, and had hung it in her bedroom, an honour which Cyril appreciated. She was as happy as a woman suffering from a recent amputation can be, and compared with the long nightmare created by Samuel's monomania and illness, her existence seemed to be now a beneficent calm. Cyril, she thought, had realised the importance in her eyes of tea, of that evening hour and that companionship which were for her the flowering of the day. And she had such confidence in his goodness that she would pour the boiling water on the Horniman tea leaves even before he arrived. Certainty could not be more sure. And then on the Friday of the first week he was late. He bounded in after dark, and the state of his clothes indicated too clearly that he had been playing football in the mud that was a grassy field in summer. "Have you been kept in, my boy?" she asked, for the sake of form. "No, mother," he said casually. "We were just kicking a ball about a bit. Am I late?" "Better go and tidy yourself," she said, not replying to his question. "You can't sit down in that state. And I'll have some fresh tea made. This is spoilt." "Oh, very well." Her sacred tea, the institution which she wanted to hallow by long habit, and which was to count before everything for both of them, had been carelessly sacrificed to the kicking of a football in mud, and his father buried not 10 days. She was wounded, a deep, clean, dangerous wound that would not bleed. She tried to be glad that he had not lied. He might easily have lied, saying that he had been detained for a fault and could not help being late. No, he was not given to lying. He would lie like any human being when a great occasion demanded such prudence, but he was not a liar. He might fairly be called a truthful boy. She tried to be glad, and did not succeed. She would have preferred him to have lied. Amy, grumbling, had to boil more water. When he returned to the parlour, superficially cleaned, Constance expected him to apologise in his roundabout boyish way, at any rate to woo and wheedle her, to show by some gesture that he was conscious of having put an affront on her. But his attitude was quite otherwise. His attitude was rather brusque and overbearing and noisy. He ate a very considerable amount of jam, far too quickly, and then asked for more, in the tone of a monarch who calls for his own. And ere tea was finished, he said boldly, apropos of nothing: "I say, mother, you'll just have to let me go to the School of Art after Easter," and stared at her with a fixed challenge in his eyes. He meant by the School of Art the evening classes at the School of Art. His father had decided absolutely against the project. His father had said that it would interfere with his lessons, would keep him up too late at night, and involve absence from home in the evening. The last had always been the real objection. His father had not been able to believe that Cyril's desire to study art sprang purely from his love of art. He could not avoid suspecting that it was a plan to obtain freedom in the evenings, that freedom which Samuel had invariably forbidden. In all Cyril's suggestions, Samuel had been ready to detect the same scheme lurking. He had finally said that when Cyril left school and took to a vocation, then he could study art at night if he chose, but not before. "You know what father said," Constance replied. "But, mother, that's all very well. I'm sure father would have agreed. If I'm going to take up drawing, I ought to do it at once. That's what the drawing master says, and I suppose he ought to know." He finished on a tone of insolence. "I can't allow you to do it yet," said Constance quietly. "It's quite out of the question. Quite." He pouted, and then he sulked. It was war between them. At times he was the image of his Aunt Sophia. He would not leave the subject alone, but he would not listen to Constance's reasoning. He openly accused her of harshness. He asked her how she could expect him to get on if she thwarted him in his most earnest desires. He pointed to other boys whose parents were wiser. "It's all very fine of you to put it on father," he observed sarcastically. He gave up his drawing entirely. When she hinted that if he attended the School of Art she would be condemned to solitary evenings, he looked at her as though saying, "Well, and if you are?" He seemed to have no heart. After several weeks of intense unhappiness, she said: "How many evenings do you want to go?" The war was over. He was charming again. When she was alone she could cling to him again. And she said to herself: "If we can be happy together only when I give way to him, I must give way to him." And there was ecstasy in her yielding. After all, she said to herself, perhaps it's very important that he should go to the School of Art. She solaced herself with such thoughts on 3 solitary evenings a week, waiting for him to come home. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7 of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by Andy Minter. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Book 2. Constance. Chapter 7. Bricks and Mortar. 1. In the summer of that year, the occurrence of a white rash of posters on hoardings and on certain houses and shops was symptomatic of organic change in the town. The posters were iterations of a mysterious announcement and summons which began with the august words: "By order of the trustees of the late William Clewes Merricarp, Esquire." Merricarp had been a considerable owner of property in Bursley. After a prolonged residence at Southport, he had died at the age of 82, leaving his property behind. For 60 years he had been a name, not a figure, and the news of his death, which was assuredly an event, incited the burgesses to gossip, for they had come to regard him as one of the invisible immortals. Constance was shocked, though she had never seen Merricarp. "Everybody dies nowadays," she thought. He owned the Baines Povey shop, and also Mr. Critchlow's shop. Constance knew not how often her father, and later her husband, had renewed the lease of those properties that were now hers, but from her earliest recollections rose a vague memory of her father talking to her mother about Merricarp's rent, which was, and always had been, 100 a year. Merricarp had earned the reputation of being a good landlord. Constance said sadly, "We shall never have another as good." When a lawyer's clerk called and asked her to permit the exhibition of a poster in each of her shop windows, she had misgivings for the future. She was worried. She decided that she would determine the lease next year, so as to be on the safe side. But immediately afterwards she decided that she could decide nothing. The posters continued: "To be sold by auction at the Tiger Hotel at 6:30 for 7 o'clock precisely." What 6:30 had to do with 7 o'clock precisely, no one knew. Then, after stating the name and credentials of the auctioneer, the posters at length arrived at the objects to be sold. All those freehold messuages and shops and copyhold tenements, namely. Houses were never sold by auction in Bursley. At moments of auction, burgesses were reminded that the erections they lived in were not houses, as they had falsely supposed, but messuages. Having got as far as namely, the posters ruled a line, and began afresh. Lot 1. All that extensive and commodious shop and messuage, with the offices and appurtenances thereto belonging, situate and being, number 4 St. Luke's Square, in the parish of Bursley, in the county of Stafford, and at present in the occupation of Mrs. Constance Povey, widow, under a lease expiring in September 1889. Thus clearly asserting that all Constance's shop was for sale, its whole entirety, and not a fraction or a slice of it merely. The posters proceeded. Lot 2. All that extensive and commodious shop and messuage, with the offices and appurtenances thereto belonging, situate and being, number 3 St. Luke's Square, in the parish of Bursley, in the county of Stafford, and at present in the occupation of Charles Critchlow, chemist, under an agreement for a yearly tenancy. The catalogue ran to 14 lots. The posters, lest any one should foolishly imagine that a non-legal intellect could have achieved such explicit and comprehensive clarity of statement, were signed by a powerful firm of solicitors in Hanbridge. Happily, in the Five Towns there were no metaphysicians, otherwise the firm might have been expected to explain, in the further particulars and conditions which the posters promised, how even a messuage could be the thing at which it was situate. Within a few hours of the outbreak of the rash, Mr. Critchlow abruptly presented himself before Constance at the millinery counter. He was waving a poster. "Well," he exclaimed grimly, "what next, eh?" "Yes, indeed," Constance responded. "Are you thinking of buying?" he asked. All the assistants, including Miss Insull, were in hearing, but he ignored their presence. "Buying?" repeated Constance. "Not me. I've got quite enough house property as it is." Like all owners of real property, she usually adopted towards her possessions an attitude implying that she would be willing to pay someone to take them from her. "Shall you?" she added, with Mr. Critchlow's own brusqueness. "Me buy property in St. Luke's Square?" Mr. Critchlow sneered, and then left the shop as suddenly as he had entered it. The sneer at St. Luke's Square was his characteristic expression of an opinion which had been slowly forming for some years. The square was no longer what it had been, though individual businesses might be as good as ever. For nearly 12 months 2 shops had been to let in it, and once bankruptcy had stained its annals. The tradesmen had naturally searched for a cause in every direction save the right one, the obvious one, and naturally they had found a cause. According to the tradesmen, the cause was this football. The Bursley Football Club had recently swollen into a genuine rival of the ancient supremacy of the celebrated Knype Club. It had transformed itself into a limited company, and rented a ground up the Moorthorne Road, and built a grandstand. The Bursley FC had tied with the Knype FC on the Knype ground. A prodigious achievement, an achievement which occupied a column of the Athletic News one Monday morning. But were the tradesmen civically proud of this glory? No, they said that this football drew people out of the town on Saturday afternoons, to the complete abolition of shopping. They said also that people thought of nothing but this football, and nearly in the same breath that only roughs and good-for-nothings could possibly be interested in such a barbarous game. And they spoke of gate money, gambling, and professionalism, and the end of all true sport in England. In brief, something new had come to the front, and was submitting to the ordeal of the curse. The sale of the Merricarp estate had a particular interest for respectable, stake-in-the-town persons. It would indicate to what extent, if at all, this football was ruining Bursley. Constance mentioned to Cyril that she fancied she might like to go to the sale, and as it was dated for one of Cyril's off nights, Cyril said that he fancied he might like to go too. So they went together. Samuel used to attend property sales, but he had never taken his wife to one. Constance and Cyril arrived at the Tiger shortly after 7 o'clock, and were directed to a room furnished and arranged as for a small public meeting of philanthropists. A few gentlemen were already present, but not the instigating trustees, solicitors, and auctioneers. It appeared that 6:30 for 7 o'clock precisely meant 7:15. Constance took a Windsor chair in the corner nearest the door, and motioned Cyril to the next chair. They dared not speak. They moved on tiptoe. Cyril inadvertently dragged his chair along the floor, and produced a scrunching sound. He blushed as though he had desecrated a church, and his mother made a gesture of horror. The remainder of the company glanced at the corner, apparently pained by this negligence. Some of them greeted Constance, but self-consciously, with a sort of shamed air. It might have been that they had all nefariously gathered together there for the committing of a crime. Fortunately, Constance's widowhood had already lost its touching novelty, so that the greetings, if self-conscious, were at any rate given without unendurable commiseration, and did not cause awkwardness. When the official world arrived, fussy, bustling, bearing documents and a hammer, the general feeling of guilty shame was intensified. Useless for the auctioneer to try to dissipate the groom by means of bright gestures and quick, cheerful remarks to his supporters. Cyril had an idea that the meeting would open with a hymn, until the appearance of a tapster with wine showed him his error. The auctioneer very particularly enjoined the tapster to see to it that no one lacked for his thirst, and the tapster became self-consciously energetic. He began by choosing Constance for service. In refusing wine she blushed. Then the fellow offered a glass to Cyril, who went scarlet and mumbled "No," with a lump in his throat. When the tapster's back was turned, he smiled sheepishly at his mother. The majority of the company accepted and sipped. The auctioneer sipped, and loudly smacked, and said, "Ah!" Mr. Critchlow came in, and the auctioneer said again, "Ah, I'm always glad when the tenants come. That's always a good sign." He glanced round for approval of this sentiment, but everybody seemed too stiff to move. Even the auctioneer was self-conscious. "Waiter, offer wine to Mr. Critchlow," he exclaimed bullyingly, as if saying, "Man, what on earth are you thinking of, to neglect Mr. Critchlow?" "Yes, sir, yes, sir," said the waiter, who was dispensing wine as fast as a waiter can. The auction commenced. Seizing the hammer, the auctioneer gave a short biography of William Clewes Merricarp, and, this pious duty accomplished, called upon a solicitor to read the conditions of sale. The solicitor complied, and made a distressing exhibition of self-consciousness. The conditions of sale were very lengthy, and apparently composed in a foreign tongue, and the audience listened to this elocution with a stoical pretence of breathless interest. Then the auctioneer put up all that extensive and commodious messuage and shop situate and being No. 4 St. Luke's Square. Constance and Cyril moved their limbs surreptitiously, as though being at last found out. The auctioneer referred to John Baines and to Samuel Povey with a sense of personal loss, and then expressed his pleasure in the presence of "the ladies." He meant Constance, who once more had to blush. "Now, gentlemen," said the auctioneer, "what do you say for these famous premises? I think I do not exaggerate when I use the word famous." Some one said £1,000 in the terrorised voice of a delinquent. £1,000, repeated the auctioneer, paused, sipped, and smacked. Guineas, said another voice, self-accused of iniquity. 1,050, said the auctioneer. Then there was a long interval, an interval that tightened the nerves of the assembly. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer adjured. The first voice said sulkily, 1,100. And thus the bids rose to 1,500, lifted bit by bit, as it were, by the magnetic force of the auctioneer's personality. The man was now standing up in domination. He bent down to the solicitor's head. They whispered together. "Gentlemen," said the auctioneer, "I am happy to inform you that the sale is now open." His tone translated better than words his calm professional beatitude. Suddenly, in a voice of wrath, he hissed at the waiter, "Waiter, why don't you serve these gentlemen?" "Yes, sir, yes, sir." The auctioneer sat down and sipped at leisure, chatting with his clerk and the solicitor and the solicitor's clerk. When he rose, it was as a conqueror. "Gentlemen, 1,500 is bid. Now, Mr. Critchlow?" Mr. Critchlow shook his head. The auctioneer threw a courteous glance at Constance, who avoided it. After many adjurations, he reluctantly raised his hammer, pretended to let it fall, and saved it several times. And then Mr. Critchlow said, "And 50?" 1,550 is bid, the auctioneer informed the company, electrifying the waiter once more. And when he had sipped, he said, with feigned sadness, "Come, gentlemen, you surely don't mean to let this magnificent lot go for £1,550?" But they did mean that. The hammer fell, and the auctioneer's clerk and the solicitor's clerk took Mr. Critchlow aside and wrote with him. Nobody was surprised when Mr. Critchlow bought lot number 2, his own shop. Constance whispered then to Cyril that she wished to leave. They left with unnatural precautions, but instantly regained their natural demeanour in the dark street. "Well, I never! Well, I never!" she murmured outside, astonished and disturbed. She hated the prospect of Mr. Critchlow as a landlord, and yet she could not persuade herself to leave the place in spite of decisions. The sale demonstrated that football had not entirely undermined the commercial basis of society in Bursley. Only 2 lots had to be withdrawn. 2. On Thursday afternoon of the same week, the youth whom Constance had ended by hiring for the manipulation of shutters and other jobs unsuitable for fragile women was closing the shop. The clock had struck 2. All the shutters were up except the last one. In the midst of the doorway, Miss Insull and her mistress were walking about the darkened interior, putting dust sheets well over the edges of exposed goods. The other assistants had just left. The bull terrier had wandered into the shop, as he almost invariably did at closing time, for he slept there, an efficient guard, and had lain down by the dying stove. Though not venerable, he was stiffening into age. "You can shut," said Miss Insull to the youth. But as the final shutter was ascending to its position, Mr. Critchlow appeared on the pavement. "Hold on, young feller," Mr. Critchlow commanded, and stepped slowly, lifting up his long apron over the horizontal shutter on which the perpendicular shutters rested in the doorway. "Shall you be long, Mr. Critchlow?" the youth asked, posing the shutter, "or am I to shut?" "Shut, lad," said Mr. Critchlow briefly. "I'll go out by the side door." "Here's Mr. Critchlow," Miss Insull called out to Constance in a peculiar tone, and a flush, scarcely perceptible, crept very slowly over her dark features. In the twilight of the shop, lit only by a few starry holes in the shutters and by the small side window, not the keenest eye could have detected that flush. "Mr. Critchlow!" Constance murmured the exclamation. She resented his future ownership of her shop. She thought he was come to play the landlord, and she determined to let him see that her mood was independent and free, that she would as lief give up the business as keep it. In particular, she meant to accuse him of having deliberately deceived her as to his intentions on his previous visit. "Well, missus," the aged man greeted her, "we've made it up between us. Happen some folk'll think we've taken our time, but I don't know as that's their affair." His little blinking eyes had a red border. The skin of his pale small face was wrinkled in millions of minute creases. His arms and legs were marvellously thin and sharply angular. The corners of his heliotrope lips were turned down, as usual, in a mysterious comment on the world, and his smile, as he fronted Constance with his excessive height, crowned the mystery. Constance stared, at a loss. It surely could not after all be true, the substance of the rumours that had floated like vapours in the square for 8 years and more. "What—" she began. "Me and her." He jerked his head in the direction of Miss Insull. The dog had leisurely strolled forward to inspect the edges of the fiancée's trousers. Miss Insull summoned the animal with a noise of fingers, and then bent down and caressed it, a strange gesture, proving the validity of Charles Critchlow's discovery that in Maria Insull a human being was buried. Miss Insull was, as near as any one could guess, 40 years of age. For 25 years she had served in the shop, passing about 12 hours a day in the shop, attending regularly at least 3 religious services at the Wesleyan chapel or school on Sundays, and sleeping with her mother, whom she kept. She had never earned more than 30 shillings a week, and yet her situation was considered to be exceptionally good. In the eternal fusty dark of the shop she had gradually lost such sexual characteristics and charms as she had once possessed. She was as thin and flat as Charles Critchlow himself. It was as though her bosom had suffered from a prolonged drought at a susceptible period of development, and had never recovered. The one proof that blood ran in her veins was the pimply quality of her ruined complexion, and the pimples of that brickish expanse proved that the blood was thin and bad. Her hands and feet were large and ungainly. The skin of the fingers was roughened by coarse contacts to the texture of emery paper. On 6 days a week she wore black; on the 7th a kind of discreet half mourning. She was honest, capable, and industrious, and beyond the confines of her occupation she had no curiosity, no intelligence, no ideas. Superstitions and prejudices, deep and violent, served her for ideas, but she could incomparably sell silks and bonnets, braces and oilcloth; in widths, lengths, and prices she never erred. She never annoyed a customer, nor foolishly promised what could not be performed, nor was late, nor negligent, nor disrespectful. No one knew anything about her, because there was nothing to know. Subtract the shop assistant from her, and naught remained. Benighted and spiritually dead, she existed by habit. But for Charles Critchlow she happened to be an illusion. He had cast eyes on her, and had seen youth, innocence, virginity. During 8 years the moth Charles had flitted round the lamp of her brilliance, and was now singed past escape. He might treat her with what casualness he chose. He might ignore her in public. He might talk brutally about women. He might leave her to wonder daily what he meant for months at a stretch. But there emerged indisputable from the sum of his conduct the fact that he wanted her. He desired her. She charmed him. She was something ornamental and luxurious, for which he was ready to pay, and to commit follies. He had been a widower since before she was born. To him she was a slip of a girl. All is relative in this world. As for her, she was too indifferent to refuse him. Why refuse him? Oysters do not refuse. "I'm sure I congratulate you both," Constance breathed, realizing the import of Mr. Critchlow's laconic words. "I'm sure I hope you'll be happy." "I'll be all right," said Mr. Critchlow. "Thank you, Mrs. Povey," said Maria Insull. Nobody seemed to know what to say next. "It's rather sudden," was on Constance's tongue, but did not achieve utterance, being patently absurd. "Ah!" exclaimed Mr. Critchlow, as though himself contemplating anew the situation. Miss Insull gave the dog a final pat. "So that's settled," said Mr. Critchlow. "Now, missus, you want to give up this shop, don't you?" "I'm not sure about that," Constance answered uneasily. "Don't tell me," he protested. "Of course you want to give up the shop." "I've lived here all my life," said Constance. "You've not lived in the shop all your life. I said the shop. Listen here," he continued. "I've got a proposal to make to you. You can keep on the house, and I'll take the shop off your hands. Now." He looked at her inquiringly. Constance was taken aback by the brusqueness of the suggestion, which, moreover, she did not understand. "But how—" "Come here," said Mr. Critchlow impatiently, and he moved towards the house door of the shop, behind the till. "Come where? What do you want?" Constance demanded in amaze. "Here," said Mr. Critchlow, with increasing impatience. "Follow me, will you?" Constance obeyed. Miss Insull sidled after Constance, and the dog after Miss Insull. Mr. Critchlow went through the doorway and down the corridor, past the cutting-out room to his right. The corridor then turned at a right angle to the left, and ended at the parlour door, the kitchen steps being to the left. Mr. Critchlow stopped short of the kitchen steps, and extended his arms, touching the walls on either side. "Here," he said, tapping the walls with his bony knuckles. "Here, suppose I brick you this up, and the same upstairs between the showroom and the bedroom passage. You've got your house to yourself. You say you've lived here all your life. Well, what's to prevent you finishing up here? The fact is," he added, "it would only be making into two houses again what was two houses to start with. Afore your time, missus." "And what about the shop?" cried Constance. "You can sell us the stock at valuation." Constance suddenly comprehended the scheme. Mr. Critchlow would remain the chemist, while Mrs. Critchlow became the head of the chief drapery business in the town. Doubtless they would knock a hole through the separating wall on the other side, to balance the bricking up on this side. They must have thought it all out in detail. Constance revolted. "Yes," she said, a little disdainfully. "And my goodwill, shall you take that at valuation too?" Mr. Critchlow glanced at the creature for whom he was ready to scatter thousands of pounds. She might have been a Phryne, and he the infatuated fool. He glanced at her as if to say, "We expected this, and this is where we agreed it was to stop." "Ay," he said to Constance, "show me your goodwill. Wrap it up in a bit of paper and hand it over, and I'll take it at valuation. But not afore, missus, not afore. I'm making you a very good offer. £20 a year I'll let you the house for, and take the stock at valuation. Think it over, my lass." Having said what he had to say, Charles Critchlow departed according to his custom. He unceremoniously let himself out by the side door, and passed with wavy apron round the corner of King Street into the square, and so to his own shop, which ignored the Thursday half-holiday. Miss Insull left soon afterwards. 3. Constance's pride urged her to refuse the offer, but in truth her sole objection to it was that she had not thought of the scheme herself, for the scheme really reconciled her wish to remain where she was with her wish to be free of the shop. "I shall make him put me in a new window in the parlour, one that will open," she said positively to Cyril, who accepted Mr. Critchlow's idea with fatalistic indifference. After stipulating for the new window, she closed with the offer. Then there was the stock-taking, which endured for weeks, and then a carpenter came and measured for the window, and a builder and a mason came and inspected doorways, and Constance felt that the end was upon her. She took up the carpet in the parlour, and protected the furniture by dust-sheets. She and Cyril lived between bare boards and dust-sheets for 20 days, and neither carpenter nor mason reappeared. Then, one surprising day, the old window was removed by the carpenter's 2 journeymen, and late in the afternoon the carpenter brought the new window, and the 3 men worked till 10 o'clock at night, fixing it. Cyril wore his cap, and went to bed in his cap, and Constance wore a Paisley shawl. A painter had bound himself beyond all possibility of failure to paint the window on the morrow. He was to begin at 6 a.m., and Amy's alarm clock was altered so that she might be up and dressed to admit him. He came a week later, administered one coat, and vanished for another 10 days. Then 2 masons suddenly came with heavy tools, and were shocked to find that all was not prepared for them. After 3 carpetless weeks, Constance had relaid her floors. They tore off wallpaper, sent cascades of plaster down the kitchen steps, withdrew alternate courses of bricks from the wall, and, sated with destruction, hastened away. After 4 days, new red bricks began to arrive, carried by a quite guiltless hodman who had not visited the house before. The hodman met the full storm of Constance's wrath. It was not a vicious wrath, rather a good-humoured wrath, but it impressed the hodman. "My house hasn't been fit to live in for a month," she said in fine. "If these walls aren't built tomorrow, upstairs and down, tomorrow, mind, don't let any of you dare to show your noses here again, for I won't have you. Now, you've brought your bricks, off with you, and tell your master what I say." It was effective. The next day, subdued and plausible workmen of all sorts awoke the house with knocking at 6:30 precisely, and the 2 doorways were slowly bricked up. The curious thing was that when the barrier was already a foot high on the ground floor, Constance remembered small possessions of her own which she had omitted to remove from the cutting-out room. Picking up her skirts, she stepped over into the region that was no more hers, and stepped back with the goods. She had a bandana round her head to keep the thick dust out of her hair. She was very busy, very preoccupied with nothings. She had no time for sentimentalities. Yet, when the men arrived at the topmost course, and were at last hidden behind their own erection, and she could see only rough bricks and mortar, she was disconcertingly overtaken by a misty blindness, and could not even see bricks and mortar. Cyril found her with her absurd bandana, weeping in a sheet-covered rocking-chair in the sacked parlour. He whistled uneasily, remarked, "I say, mother, what about tea?" And then, hearing the heavy voices of workmen above, ran with relief upstairs. Tea had been set in the drawing-room. He was glad to learn that from Amy, who informed him also that she should never get used to them new walls, not as long as she lived. He went to the School of Art that night. Constance alone could find nothing to do. She had willed that the walls should be built, and they had been built. But days must elapse before they could be plastered, and after the plaster still more days before the papering. Not for another month, perhaps, would her house be free of workmen and ripe for her own labours. She could only sit in the dust drifts and contemplate the havoc of change, and keep her eyes as dry as she could. The legal transactions were all but complete. Little bills announcing the transfer of the business lay on the counters in the shop at the disposal of customers. In 2 days Charles Critchlow would pay the price of a desire realized. The sign was painted out, and new letters sketched thereon in chalk. In future she would be compelled, if she wished to enter the shop, to enter it as a customer, and from the front. Yes, she saw that though the house remained hers, the root of her life had been wrenched up. And the mess! It seemed inconceivable that the material mess could ever be straightened away. Yet, ere the fields of the county were first covered with snow that season, only one sign survived of the devastating revolution, and that was a loose sheet of wallpaper that had been too soon pasted onto new plaster and would not stick. Maria Insull was Maria Critchlow. Constance had been out into the square and seen the altered sign, and had seen Mrs. Critchlow's taste in window curtains, and seen, most impressive sight of all, that the grimy window of the abandoned room at the top of the abandoned staircase next to the bedroom of her girlhood had been cleaned and a table put in front of it. She knew that the chamber, which she herself had never entered, was to be employed as a storeroom, but the visible proof of its conversion so strangely affected her that she had not felt able to go boldly into the shop, as she had meant to do, and make a few purchases in the way of friendliness. "I am a silly woman," she muttered. Later she did venture, timidly abrupt, into the shop, and was received with fitting state by Mrs. Critchlow, as desiccated as ever, who insisted on allowing her the special trade discount, and she carried her little friendly purchases round to her own door in King Street. Trivial, trivial event! Constance, not knowing whether to laugh or cry, did both. She accused herself of developing a hysterical faculty in tears, and strove sagely against it. End of chapter 7. Book 2, Chapter 8 of The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For further information, or to volunteer, please go to LibriVox.org. Reading by andmortar. The Old Wives' Tale by Arnold Bennett. Book 2, Constance. Chapter 8. The Proudest Mother. In the year 1893 there was a new and strange man living at No. 4 St. Luke's Square. Many people remarked on the phenomenon. Very few of his like had ever been seen in Bursley before. One of the striking things about him was the complex way in which he secured himself by means of glittering chains. A chain stretched across his waistcoat, passing through a special button-hole without a button in the middle. To this cable were firmly linked a watch at one end and a pencil case at the other. The chain also served as a protection against a thief who might attempt to snatch the fancy waistcoat entire. Then there were longer chains beneath the waistcoat, partly designed, no doubt, to deflect bullets, but serving mainly to enable the owner to haul up penknives, cigarette cases, match-boxes, and key-rings from the profundities of hip pockets. An essential portion of the man's braces, visible sometimes when he played at tennis, consisted of a chain, and the upper and nether halves of his cuff-links were connected by chains. Occasionally he was to be seen chained to a dog. A reversion, conceivably, to a mediaeval type? Yes, but also the exemplar of the excessively modern. Externally he was a consequence of the fact that, years previously, the leading tailor in Bursley had permitted his son to be apprenticed in London. The father died, the son had the wit to return and make a fortune while creating a new type in the town, a type of which multiple chains were but one feature, and that the least expensive, if the most salient. For instance, up to the historic year in which the young tailor created the type, any cap was a cap in Bursley, and any collar was a collar. But thenceforward no cap was a cap, and no collar was a collar, which did not exactly conform in shape and material to certain sacred caps and collars guarded by the young tailor in his back shop. None knew why these sacred caps and collars were sacred, but they were. Their sacredness endured for about 6 months, and then suddenly, again none knew why, they fell from their estate, and became lower than offal for dogs, and were supplanted on the altar. The type brought into existence by the young tailor was to be recognised by its caps and collars, and in a similar manner by every other article of attire, except its boots. Unfortunately, the tailor did not sell boots, and so imposed on his creatures no mystical creed as to boots. This was a pity, for the bootmakers of the town happened not to be inflamed by the type-creating passion as the tailor was, and thus the new type finished abruptly at the edges of the tailor's trousers. The man at No. 4 St. Luke's Square had comparatively small and narrow feet, which gave him an advantage, and as he was endowed with a certain vague general physical distinction, he managed, despite the internal untidiness of his hair, to be eminent among the type. Assuredly, the frequent sight of him in her house flattered the pride of Constance's eye, which rested on him almost always with pleasure. He had come into the house with startling abruptness, soon after Cyril left school, and was indentured to the head designer at Peel's, that classic earthenware manufactory. The presence of a man in her abode disconcerted Constance at the beginning, but she soon grew accustomed to it, perceiving that a man would behave as a man, and must be expected to do so. This man, in truth, did what he liked in all things. Cyril having always been regarded by both his parents as enormous, one would have anticipated a giant in the new man, but queerly he was slim and little above the average height. Neither in enormity nor in many other particulars did he resemble the Cyril whom he had supplanted. His gestures were lighter and quicker. He had nothing of Cyril's ungainliness. He had not Cyril's limitless taste for sweets, nor Cyril's terrific hatred of gloves, barbers, and soap. He was much more dreamy than Cyril, and much busier. In fact, Constance only saw him at meal times. He was at Peel's in the day, and at the School of Art every night. He would dream during a meal even, and without actually saying so, he gave the impression that he was the busiest man in Bursley, wrapped in occupations and preoccupations as in a blanket which Constance had difficulty in penetrating. Constance wanted to please him. She lived for nothing but to please him. He was, however, exceedingly difficult to please, not in the least because he was hypercritical and exacting, but because he was indifferent. Constance, in order to satisfy her desire of pleasing, had to make 50 efforts in the hope that he might chance to notice one. He was a good man, amazingly industrious, when once Constance had got him out of bed in the morning, with no vices, kind, save when Constance mistakenly tried to thwart him, charming, with a curious sense of humour that Constance only half understood. Constance was unquestionably vain about him, and she could honestly find in him little to blame. But whereas he was the whole of her universe, she was merely a dim figure in the background of his. Every now and then, with his gentle, elegant raillery, he would apparently rediscover her, as though saying, "Ah, you're still there, are you?" Constance could not meet him on the plane where his interests lay, and he never knew the passionate intensity of her absorption in that minor part of his life which moved on her plane. He never worried about her solitude, or guessed that in throwing her a smile and a word at supper he was paying her meagrely for 3 hours of lone rockings in a rocking-chair. The worst of it was that she was quite incurable. No experience would suffice to cure her trick of continually expecting him to notice things which he never did notice. One day he said, in the midst of a silence, "By the way, didn't father leave any boxes of cigars?" She had the steps up into her bedroom, and reached down from the dusty top of the wardrobe the box which she had put there after Samuel's funeral. In handing him the box she was doing a great deed. His age was 19, and she was ratifying his precocious habit of smoking by this solemn gift. He entirely ignored the box for several days. She said timidly, "Have you tried those cigars?" "Not yet," he replied. "I'll try 'em one of these days." 10 days later, on a Sunday, when he chanced not to have gone out with his aristocratic friend, Matthew Peel Swinnerton, he did at length open the box and take out a cigar. "Now," he observed roguishly, cutting the cigar, "we shall see Mrs. Plover." He often called her Mrs. Plover for fun. Though she liked him to be sufficiently interested in her to tease her, she did not like being called Mrs. Plover, and she never failed to say, "I'm not Mrs. Plover." He smoked the cigar slowly, in the rocking-chair, throwing his head back and sending clouds to the ceiling, and afterwards he remarked, "The old man's cigars weren't so bad." "Indeed," she answered tartly, as if maternally resenting this easy patronage. But in secret she was delighted. There was something in her son's favourable verdict on her husband's cigars that thrilled her. And she looked at him. Impossible to see in him any resemblance to his father. Oh, he was a far more brilliant, more advanced, more complicated, more seductive being than his homely father. She wondered where he had come from. And yet, if his father had lived, what would have occurred between them? Would the boy have been openly smoking cigars in the house at 19? She laboriously interested herself, so far as he would allow, in his artistic studies and productions. A back attic on the second floor was now transformed into a studio, a naked apartment which smelt of oil and of damp clay. Often there were traces of clay on the stairs. For working in clay he demanded of his mother a smock, and she made a smock on the model of a genuine smock which she obtained from a countrywoman who sold eggs and butter in the covered market. Into the shoulders of the smock she put a week's fancy stitching, taking the pattern from an old book of embroidery. One day, when he had seen her stitching, morn, noon, and afternoon, at the smock, he said, as she rocked idly after supper, I suppose you haven't forgotten all about the smock I asked you for, have you, mater?" She knew that he was teasing her, but while perfectly realising how foolish she was, she nearly always acted as though his teasing was serious. She picked up the smock again from the sofa. When the smock was finished, he examined it intently, then exclaimed, with an air of surprise: "By Jove, that's beautiful! Where did you get this pattern?" He continued to stare at it, smiling in pleasure. He turned over the tattered leaves of the embroidery book with the same naive, charmed astonishment, and carried the book away to the studio. "I must show that to Swinnerton," he said. As for her, the epithet "beautiful" seemed a strange epithet to apply to a mere piece of honest stitchery done in a pattern, and a stitch with which she had been familiar all her life. The fact was, she understood his art less and less. The sole wall decoration of his studio was a Japanese print, which struck her as being entirely preposterous, considered as a picture. She much preferred his own early drawings of moss roses and picturesque castles, things that he now mercilessly condemned. Later, he discovered her cutting out another smock. "What's that for?" he inquired. "Well," she said, "you can't manage with one smock. What shall you do when that one has to go to the wash?" "Wash?" he repeated vaguely. "There's no need for it to go to the wash." "Cyril," she replied, "don't try my patience. I was thinking of making you half a dozen." He whistled. "With all that stitching?" he questioned, amazed at the undertaking. "Why not?" she said. In her young days no sempstress ever made fewer than half a dozen of anything, and it was usually a dozen. It was sometimes a half a dozen. "Well," he murmured, "you've got a nerve, I'll say that." Similar things happened whenever he showed that he was pleased. If he said of a dish, in a local tongue, "I could do with a bit of that," or if he simply smacked his lips over it, she would surfeit him with that dish. 2. On a hot day in August, just before they were about to leave Bursley for a month in the Isle of Man, Cyril came home, pale and perspiring, and dropped onto the sofa. He wore a grey alpaca suit, and except his hair, which, in addition to being very untidy, was damp with sweat, he was a masterpiece of slim elegance, despite the heat. He blew out great sighs, and rested his head on the antimacassared arm of the sofa. "Well, mater," he said, in a voice of factitious calm, "I've got it." He was looking up at the ceiling. "Got what?" "The National Scholarship. Swinnerton says it's a sheer fluke, but I've got it. Great glory for the Bursley School of Art." "National Scholarship?" she said. "What's that? What is it?" "Now, mother," he admonished her, not without testiness, "don't go and say I've never breathed a word about it." He lit a cigarette to cover his self-consciousness, for he perceived that she was moved far beyond the ordinary. Never, in fact, not even by the death of her husband, had she received such a frightful blow as that which the dreamy Cyril had just dealt her. It was not a complete surprise, but it was nearly a complete surprise. A few months previously he certainly had mentioned, in his incidental way, the subject of a national scholarship. Apropos of a drinking cup which he had designed, he had said that the director of the School of Art had suggested that it was good enough to compete for the national, and that as he was otherwise qualified for the competition, he might as well send the cup to South Kensington. He had added that Peel Swinnerton had laughed at the notion as absurd. On that occasion she had comprehended that a national scholarship involved residence in London. She ought to have begun to live in fear, for Cyril had a most disturbing habit of making a mere momentary reference to matters which he deemed very important, and which occupied a large share of his attention. He was secretive by nature, and the rigidity of his father's rule had developed this trait in his character. But really he had spoken of the competition with such an extreme casualness that with little effort she had dismissed it from her anxieties as involving a contingency so remote as to be negligible. She had, genuinely, almost forgotten it. Only at rare intervals had it wakened in her a dull transitory pain, like the herald of a fatal malady. And as a woman in the opening stage of a disease, she had hastily reassured herself, "How silly of me! This can't possibly be anything serious." And now she was condemned. She knew it. She knew there could be no appeal. She knew that she might as usefully have besought mercy from a tiger as from her good, industrious, dreamy son. "It means £1 a week," said Cyril, his self-consciousness intensified by her silence and by the dreadful look on her face. "And, of course, free tuition." "For how long?" she managed to say. "Well," said he, "that depends. Nominally for a year. But if you behave yourself, it's always continued for 3 years." If he stayed for 3 years, he would never come back. That was a certainty. How she rebelled, furious and despairing, against the fortuitous cruelty of things! She was sure that he had not, till then, thought seriously of going to London. But the fact that the Government would admit him free to its classrooms, and give him £1 a week besides, somehow forced him to go to London. It was not lack of means that would have prevented him from going. Why then should the presence of means induce him to go? There was no logical reason. The whole affair was disastrously absurd. The art master at the Wedgwood Institution had merely chanced, to suggest that the drinking cup should be sent to South Kensington, and the result of this caprice was that she was sentenced to solitude for life. It was too monstrously, too incredibly wicked. With what futile and bitter execration she murmured in her heart the word "if." If Cyril's childish predilections had not been encouraged, if he had only been content to follow his father's trade, if she had flatly refused to sign his indenture at Peel's and pay the premium, if he had not turned from colour to clay, if the art master had not had that fatal idea, if the judges for the competition had decided otherwise, if only she had brought Cyril up in habits of obedience, sacrificing temporary peace to permanent security. For after all, he could not abandon her without her consent. He was not of age, and he would want a lot more money, which he could obtain from none but her. She could refuse. No, she could not refuse. He was the master, the tyrant. For the sake of daily pleasantness she had weakly yielded to him at the start. She had behaved badly to herself and to him. He was spoiled. She had spoiled him. And he was about to repay her with lifelong misery, and nothing would deflect him from his course, the usual conduct of the spoilt child. Had she not witnessed it and moralised upon it in other families? "You don't seem very chirpy over it, mater," he said. She went out of the room. His joy in the prospect of departure from the Five Towns, from her, though he masked it, was more manifest than she could bear. The Signal, the next day, made a special item of the news. It appeared that no national scholarship had been won in the Five Towns for 11 years. The citizens were exhorted to remember that Mr. Povey had gained his success in open competition with the cleverest young students of the entire kingdom, and in a branch of art which he had but recently taken up, and further that the Government offered only 8 scholarships each year. The name of Cyril Povey passed from lip to lip, and nobody who met Constance in street or shop could refrain from informing her that she ought to be a proud mother to have such a son, but that truly they were not surprised. And how proud his poor father would have been! A few sympathetically hinted that maternal pride was one of those luxuries that may cost too dear. 3. The holiday in the Isle of Man was of course ruined for her. She could scarcely walk because of the weight of a lump of lead that she carried in her bosom. On the brightest days the lump of lead was always there. Besides, she was so obese. In ordinary circumstances they might have stayed beyond the month. An indentured pupil is not strapped to the wheel like a common apprentice. Moreover, the indentures were to be cancelled. But Constance did not care to stay. She had to prepare for his departure to London. She had to lay the faggots for her own martyrdom. In this business of preparation she showed as much silliness, she betrayed as perfect a lack of perspective as the most superior son could desire for a topic of affectionate irony. Her preoccupation with petty things of no importance whatever was worthy of the finest traditions of fond motherhood. However, Cyril's careless satire had no effect on her, save that once she got angry, thereby startling him. He quite correctly and sagely laid this unprecedented outburst to the account of her wrought nerves, and forgave it. Happily for the smoothness of Cyril's translation to London, young Peel Swynnerton was acquainted with the capital, had a brother in Chelsea, knew of reputable lodgings, was indeed an encyclopaedia of the town, and would himself spend a portion of the autumn there. Otherwise, the preliminaries which his mother would have insisted on by means of tears and hysteria might have proved fatiguing to Cyril. The day came when, on that day week, Cyril would be gone. Constance steadily fabricated cheerfulness against the prospect. She said, "Suppose I come with you?" He smiled in toleration of this joke as being a passable quality of joke. And then she smiled in the same sense, hastening to agree with him that, as a joke, it was not a bad joke. In the last week he was very loyal to his tailor. Many a young man would have commanded new clothes after, not before, his arrival in London. But Cyril had faith in his Creator. On the day of departure, the household, the very house itself, was in a state of excitation. He was to leave early. He would not listen to the project of her accompanying him as far as Knype, where the loop line joined the main. She might go to Bursley station and no further. When she rebelled, he disclosed the merest hint of his sullen, churlish side, and she at once yielded. During breakfast she did not cry, but the aspect of her face made him protest. "Now look here, mater, just try to remember I shall be back for Christmas. It's barely 3 months." And he lit a cigarette. She made no reply. Amy lugged a Gladstone bag down the crooked stairs. A trunk was already close to the door. It had wrinkled the carpet and deranged the mat. "You didn't forget to put the hairbrush in, did you, Amy?" he asked. "No, Mr. Cyril," she blubbered. "Amy," Constance sharply corrected her, as Cyril ran upstairs, "I wonder you can't control yourself better than that." Amy weakly apologised. Although treated almost as one of the family, she ought not to have forgotten that she was a servant. What right had she to weep over Cyril's luggage? This question was put to her in Constance's tone. The cab came. Cyril tumbled downstairs with exaggerated carelessness, and with exaggerated carelessness he joked at the cabman. "Now, mother," he cried, when the luggage was stowed, "do you want me to miss this train?" But he knew that the margin of time was ample. It was his fun. "Nay, I can't be hurried," she said, fixing her bonnet. "Amy, as soon as we're gone you can clear this table." She climbed heavily into the cab. "That's it, smash the springs," Cyril teased her. The horse got a stinging cut to recall him to the seriousness of life. It was a fine, bracing autumn morning, and the driver felt the need of communicating his abundant energy to someone or something. They drove off, Amy staring after them from the door. Matters had been so marvellously well arranged that they arrived at the station 20 minutes before the train was due. "Never mind," Cyril mockingly comforted his mother. "You'd rather be 20 minutes too soon than 1 minute too late, wouldn't you?" His high spirits had to come out somehow. Gradually the minutes passed, and the empty slate-tinted platform became dotted with people to whom that train was nothing but a loop-line train, people who took that train every weekday of their lives and knew all its eccentricities. And they heard the train whistle as it started from Turnhill, and Cyril had a final word with the porter who was in charge of the luggage. He made a handsome figure, and he had £20 in his pocket. When he returned to Constance, she was sniffing, and through her veil he could see that her eyes were circled with red. But through her veil she could see nothing. The train rolled in, rattling to a standstill. Constance lifted her veil and kissed him, and kissed her life out. He smelt the odour of her crape. He was for an instant close to her, close, and he seemed to have an overwhelmingly intimate glimpse into her secrets. He seemed to be choked in the sudden strong emotion of that crape. He felt queer. "Here you are, sir. Second smoker," called the porter. The daily frequenters of the train boarded it, with their customary disgust. "I'll write as soon as ever I get there," said Cyril of his own accord. It was the best he could muster. With what grace he raised his hat! A sliding away, clouds of steam, and she shared the dead platform with milk cans, two porters, and Smith's noisy boy. She walked home very slowly and painfully. The lump of lead was heavier than ever before, and the townspeople saw the proudest mother in Bursley walking home. After all, she argued with her soul angrily, petulantly, could you expect the boy to do anything else? He's a serious student. He's had a brilliant success, and is he to be tied to your apron strings? The idea is preposterous. It isn't as if he were an idler or a bad son. No mother could have a better son. A nice thing that he should stay all his life in Bursley simply because you don't like being left alone. Unfortunately, one might as well argue with a mule as with one's soul. Her soul only kept saying monotonously, "I'm a lonely old woman now. I've nothing to live for any more, and I'm no use to anybody. Once I was young and proud, and this is what my life has come to. This is the end." When she reached home, Amy had not touched the breakfast things. The carpet was still wrinkled, and the mat still out of place. And through the desolating atmosphere of reaction after a terrific crisis, she marched directly upstairs, entered his plundered room, and beheld the disorder of the bed in which he had slept. End of Chapter 8. And of Book 2.